Next year will mark the 150th anniversary of the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery in the United States. And yet, the business of modern slavery is thriving around the world and right here at home. Next year, Human Rights First will be launching a public campaign to disrupt this massive global business. So we're very pleased to have such an esteemed group of experts to help us explore this issue today. And it's my privilege to introduce the moderator. As CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and a founder of Trust Law and Trust Women, Monique Villa has led the charge to trigger change and empower vulnerable groups across the world. Her tenacity for justice earned her a ranking in Ethisphere's 100 most influential people in business ethics. Through Trust Law, Monique has worked to spread the culture of pro bono legal assistance around the world. And through Trust Women, she fights the scourge of modern slavery and galvanizes support for women's empowerment. With Monique at the helm, the Thomson Reuters Foundation has also devoted attention and resources to cover the world's most underreported stories, offering training and media development to strengthen free media across the globe. She is a real powerhouse, and we are thrilled to have her with us today. Monique, welcome. The floor is yours.
Elisa, you're way too kind. I'm very happy to moderate this morning this panel about human trafficking with a bunch of people who really know what they speak of. Human trafficking, as you saw in the film, is a $150 billion business, and it's a business that is flourishing. Since 40 years ago, all the biggest companies in the world have started to outsource their production in many places without paying attention to what was going on in their supply chain. And what was going on in their supply chain sometimes is really not nice. And they have cases of slave labor in many, many different parts of the industries. So we have here private and public people to speak of how we can try. Well, bankrupt the human trafficking business is a big, difficult task, but I think we can. I think we can because, you know, you have something like, nobody knows exactly, but something like 30 million slaves in the world today. It's not 30 billion, it's 30 million people, children, 5.5 million children slaves today. Today, the Nobel Prize was given officially to Malala and Kailash Satyarthi, who has spent 30 years rescuing children in India, because you have half of the slaves in the world which live in India, which is a democracy, and it's the biggest democracy in the world. So it's just to give you an idea of the dimension of the issue. And so you can tackle the issue by many, many different angles. One, of course, which is very important and that we will speak of today, because we have two people who can speak of that, is data. Human trafficking and modern-day slavery is a silent crime. The victims very often don't know they are victims of human trafficking. They have been so much abused that they just don't know. And so it's a very silent crime. It's very difficult to know when it happens. It happens in all of our countries. It happens in the United States as in Europe. But of course, the big scourge is in Asia and Africa. To tackle at the issue, you have many different ways. And at Trust Women, which is one of the 4 programs of the foundation, we have since 3 years started to take action to try to, you know, attack the issue. And I'm very glad to have here on our panel today Barry Koch, who is now at Western Union, but before he was at JP Morgan Chase. And it was after a conversation with Barry who told me how, looking at the credit card data of its clients at JP Morgan Chase, he noticed that the chain of nail salons in New York was at very bizarre times and payments. All his clients who went to this chain of nail salons were paying between 11 p.m. in the evening and 5 a.m. in the morning. And they were never paying less than $100, which is a lot for a manicure, even in New York. So he thought it was a bit suspicious, and he discussed with friends at law enforcement agencies. And they did an investigation, and they discovered that it was not only a network of prostitution, but a network of traffickers. So just by looking at the data of his clients, Barry helped dismantle one of these terrible gangs that we have all over the world. So it was a powerful idea, and so he helped me completely build the Banks Alliance, and he will speak of that, that we did with Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan District Attorney in New York. And Barry was the engine behind. And this year, he has taken another action at the Trust Women Conference, which is to do the same alliance of banks in Europe. So it's a different issue, because in Europe, you have privacy on data, and so you cannot do exactly as we do in the US, but we will find ways. So just wanted to, I will shut up now, because I'm just someone that puts together people and try to take action. And so I will leave to Barry to speak of what he does now. He has left JP Morgan Chase, he's at Western Union. Western Union, as you know, is the place where all the people who live in here, for instance, and want to send back money to their family in Nepal or in other countries or in India or everywhere, go to do that. So Western Union is a very privileged place to see where there are instances of trafficking. So Barry, I think we all want to hear you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Monique, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? The light is green. Can you hear me now? All right, I'll speak very loud then. So I'm the Chief Compliance Officer at Western Union, and we have a little over 2,000 compliance professionals in our organization. We're doing business in over 200 countries. We have more than 500,000 locations, and we do 29 transactions per second. And anybody here who has a background in statistics or applied mathematics knows immediately what kind of data pool that provides for us to look for things that are interesting. It's 29 transactions per second, all day long, every day, 365 days of the year. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we're doing with data. But you know, Monique said something interesting when she referred to what we're doing with the Bankers Alliance that's just getting up to speed in Europe, and how it will be different because of customer privacy issues. And she said, but we'll find a way. And those words resonate with me, because we can find a way in the private sector. We can find ways to partner with the public sector and with law enforcement. And we have seen some successes in this regard. You know, when I was at JP Morgan, our financial intelligence unit thought about some projects. This was back in 2010. And you know, we were not then, and we're not now, a victim services agency. We're not law enforcement. We don't go out and arrest people. We're not politicians or legislators. We don't pass legislation. But we were in financial services, and we were able to look for the money. And anybody who thinks about the problems of human trafficking is aware of the fact that the root cause is that it's very profitable. So the way that we could make a difference, we thought, was to find the money, track the money, build statistical models showing us how the trafficking rings were operating their business, how they were moving their money, and then report those findings to law enforcement. And I should mention that financial services companies in the US and in many places around the world are legally required to do that. What we shared with law enforcement and what we share with law enforcement today is consistent with the Right to Financial Privacy Act. It's consistent with our contractual obligations to our customers to safeguard personal information. So it's not a great big data dump. It's not a fishing expedition. All of the institutions that I'm aware of who operate in this space do so within the context of the Right to Financial Privacy Act. So what we did when I was at JP Morgan in the FIU, the Financial Intelligence Unit, we actually identified 3 projects in a particular year. One was to look at travel patterns for possible terrorist financing indications. Another was to look for bulk currency smuggling that suggested red flags for drug trafficking. And the third was what we called identifying a financial footprint of human trafficking. And we set out to develop that financial footprint. And what we did was we identified certain transaction characteristics and customer attributes that we believed were higher risk for trafficking. And we based our hypothesis on public source data. We also looked to identify those transaction characteristics and customer attributes based on information that law enforcement shared with us, like spending patterns at certain types of locations, like the ones that Monique referred to, $100 charges at nail salons between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. That was based on actual case studies, and it was easy to take gargantuan amounts of spending data and really refine it and let the machine do the work and identify transactions that were worth investigating. And what we concluded as we built this model was that these transactions and customer attributes really bore a very high correlation to actual trafficking, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, underage trafficking, and we investigated those. And what we were able to see was that some of the cases that we brought to law enforcement based on the financial data led to arrests and victim rescues and asset forfeitures. So we proved the concept, and we saw we could do something good simply by following the money. So we then took all of those attributes and we scored them. We gave them mathematical scores so that the machine could do this transaction monitoring in what we call a repeatable and sustainable fashion. And JP Morgan is still doing it today, and we're doing it in a different way at Western Union, and many of the other financial institutions that participated in the alliance are doing it as well. So I took the model and I took it on the road. And I was privileged to speak at the Trust Women Conference in 2012. We presented the model, we talked about it, we formed the Bankers Alliance. It was comprised of some of the biggest financial institutions in the world, the Western Union, American Express, Citi, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, there were several others. And we published a white paper. The alliance was co-sponsored by Monique and the Thomson Reuters Foundation, along with Cyrus Vance, who is currently the New York County District Attorney. We published a white paper. It's in the materials on your table. The white paper was designed to identify for investigators in financial institutions and for investigators in law enforcement customer transactions and other attributes that were red flags for investigating trafficking cases. We published that in January of this year. We recently announced, as you heard, the formation of a European Bankers Alliance. We expect that Europol will join the Thomson Reuters Foundation to sponsor that. We will similarly have some of the largest financial institutions in the world with a presence in Europe forming the alliance, and we will look to publish something through that initiative as well. We are at Western Union. I'm happy to say that we're the first major financial institution to join Homeland Security's Blue Campaign. We'll hear a lot about the Blue Campaign in a moment. But we've actually had quite a lot of success with the educational materials that they publish. We've distributed them to tens of thousands of the people who process our transactions. We have received very interesting feedback, which has allowed us to refine our rules. It has allowed us to identify transactions that are suggestive of labor trafficking, of what we call child sexploitation on the internet, and we've had some successes at interdicting those transactions and also reporting them to law enforcement consistent with our regulatory requirements. So we have a lot of work in front of us, but it's gratifying to see that we can make a difference. What we have done has been to follow the money. There's a lot of it. And we've worked with our colleagues in the industry and our partners in law enforcement to try to make a difference in that regard.
Thank you, Barry. Just a word on this Banks Alliance. Cyrus Vance came back to the conference this year to say that since January 2014, where all the banks have signed and do now this work with the law enforcement, he has received a lot more of suspicious reports from the banks because they have integrated the red flags that very good NGOs in the US had designed to know what they look at when they look at human trafficking. So they have integrated the red flags into their software. And so it allows them to give many more suspicious reports to Cyrus Vance and his team, which leads, of course, to more prosecution. And as we know, to prosecute the traffickers is extremely difficult because the victims very often don't want to prosecute their traffickers because they are afraid, because these guys have many means to shame them forever and abuse them forever. So you are always as good as your victim, unfortunately. So the more data can come in and give certitude that there was a case of trafficking, the better we will be. So Barry spoke also of the importance of education, and indeed, it's terrible because trafficking is something that is, once again, invisible. We don't know where it is. You could very well take the bus today to come here and have a slave beside you. You don't know it. It's people who have no longer an identity. Their passport have been taken away. They are not paid. So, there are many, many ways. One of the red flags that the NGOs said is when you film at ATM, and you see that two people are at the ATM. One is doing the code, and the other one is taking the money. Usually, it's a sign that something dodgy is happening, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many, many signs. So it's very interesting. But now I will give to Maria Odom because she is the one who can speak about how you make people aware that trafficking exists, that it is in our life, that when we buy a T-shirt at $1, maybe it's not enough, and maybe there is something down in the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. She is the Citizenship and Immigration Service Ombudsman at the US Department of Homeland Security. And she has created and launched the Blue Campaign at DHS. And this is very interesting. So Maria, up to you.
Thank you very much, Monique, and I'm very happy to be here. I shall say that my predecessor, Judge Alice Hill, former senior counselor to Secretary Napolitano, was the one who helped to launch the campaign. I arrived at the Department of Homeland Security in 2012 and had the privilege of taking over as chair of the department's Blue Campaign a year ago. So this is my second hat at the department, and it is a real privilege. For those of you who are not familiar with the Blue Campaign, it is the unified effort of the department to come together, all 22 components of this very large federal department, to work together, to talk to one another, to leverage our resources, which we all know are often very limited, and to work collaboratively, both internally and externally, to advance our goal of combating human trafficking. We do that through a series of activities. And my goal today is to tell you a little bit about how we work with our partners, how we work internally, and really answer any questions you may have about our work. Our priority is to educate the public, is to run a national campaign aimed at raising awareness of this hidden crime. And Monique, you said this is a very hidden crime, and we recognize that, and that's why our television and radio PSAs allude to that. It talks about how these victims are often very hidden in our communities. It is a message for our national audience here in the United States that these individuals need to be found, and our Out of the Shadows PSA shows how this is such a hidden crime. You will soon see all of our our materials, educational materials around the country. And I'll talk a little bit about our new partnership with Travel Centers for America. One of our key successes for the Blue Campaign, now going on its 4th year, is to create a vast network of partner organizations, and they come from all over. We're very proud to be in partnership with Western Union. You were our first private sector and banking partner. We also have partnerships with NGOs, with with other government agencies, including the Department of Transportation, the Department of Education, and the Department of State. And our goal is to build a force multiplying network with the goal of using and distributing our educational materials, our human trafficking 101 online training, as well as train state and local and tribal law enforcement. So when you think of Blue Campaign, think about our public education and awareness campaign, but also think about the Department of Homeland Security taking the lead to provide training tools for state and local, tribal, and other federal law enforcement. Some of our partnerships include the National Association of Counties, the National League of Cities, the state of Arizona, and the city of Phoenix. And of course, our new partnership, which will be launched today with Travel Centers of America, which will allow us to plaster the country with our awareness materials at all travel centers located in most states in the U.S. So you will soon see, in addition to our truck stop campaign, you will see added exposure through our Travel Centers for America partnership. We do have an array of resources, and we're now receiving great feedback from the community. The tools are available online, and they're free to download. Our goal to increase the reach of the anti-human trafficking message, provide professional, effective, and current materials. We find that cities and counties and some of our other partners are eager to start the work. They're starting to recognize that this is a local problem. It does exist in our communities. It's not only a foreign national victim problem, it is a U.S. citizen victim problem. So they're just starting to see it. They need the materials to get started. Our goal is not to substitute any local campaign. In fact, I think it works best when you provide the resources, you give them the first set of resources and materials, trainings, and then that each community will come together in a coalition of, that includes partners from across sectors, educational, law enforcement, social services, you name it. Those are the strongest campaigns that you see, is those that are owned by the communities. So we're here to support them. We're here to help them launch local initiatives or refresh their local initiatives. And we're here to provide technical support to law enforcement in those communities. Recently, we have started putting together training materials in coordination with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We are going to train the trainers so that individuals working in law enforcement across Indian country will have the resources informed by the tribal communities across the U.S. to combat human trafficking in tribal lands. Now, what makes a strong partnership? A strong partnership for us is showing a commitment to raising awareness about this issue, providing information on where to report human trafficking, so being able to help us in promoting the ICE HSI tip line. We also promote the national hotline where individuals can call for services as well. They are partners who are committed to inform their employees about this issue. They make it a training priority, and we apply that internally. We work very hard at DHS to make sure that our frontline personnel are receiving the most up-to-date training resources. That includes transportation, that includes TSA, it includes FEMA, it includes Customs and Border Protection, ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and USCIS, which of course delivers immigration relief available to foreign national victims of trafficking. For us, those partnerships allow us to do this work, allow us to raise awareness nationally without appropriations. Blue Campaign does not receive appropriations. We operate with year-end contributions from components across DHS. So it is really important to know that Blue Campaign is not a program office. Blue Campaign continues to be an initiative at DHS. It is inspiring to see my colleagues from across the department join the campaign. It's a force multiplier for us. Individuals come and work at the campaign for 6 months at a time. Often they go back to their components and they continue to promote our work internally in our large and our small components. So this is an example of how we can do a lot with limited resources, and we're starting to see, I think, the positive impact of this collaboration. Our priority is to continue to expand partnerships to provide additional awareness training materials. We will continue to update our available resources. The Federal Law Enforcement Training Center takes the lead with our training, but they do so in coordination with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Homeland Security investigations. We have found that ICE HSI agents across the country at the local level are already part of many coalitions, are working very hard to train law enforcement, but also to work with NGOs and with service providers to make sure that our approach continues to be a victim-centered approach. It is key for us, and we get good, continue to receive good feedback from our stakeholders.
Maria, do you measure the impact of your campaign, or it's just, how do you know that it has an impact?
So think of it in various buckets, for lack of, because the Blue Campaign is a public awareness and education campaign, which includes a radio PSA, both in English and Spanish. It includes our posters, which you will find online, also across airports and in many venues, and it includes a television PSA. So right now, the campaign just launched in February, although the Blue Campaign has been around for some time. The media campaign just launched in February. So right now, what we have to share with the public are impressions. How much are people viewing our materials? Where are we placing them? How can we leverage our partnerships to increase the exposure of these materials? In the next year, we will be going into communities, assessing the impact of, or in the next couple of years, assessing the impact of these public education and awareness materials. Now, the other bucket of our work is law enforcement training. It is sharing training materials with our private sector partners. And we measure, there is a challenge in measuring whether this is working, and I'll tell you why. When we look at the number of investigations opened by Homeland Security investigations, we see that those numbers are going up. That is not a precise measure of the total number of investigations and prosecutions happening nationally, because some of these prosecutions are happening at the state level under state laws. We only have jurisdiction to work with the U.S. Attorney's Office to prosecute federally. And it doesn't also indicate the number of prosecutions that are going directly through the FBI or through the U.S. Attorney's offices. So we are still grappling with how to measure the impact directly related to the number of investigations that we at Homeland Security open. Recently, the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center released internally a report that shows 10 years of data collected by the federal government. It is right now for internal law enforcement use only, again, because there are gaps in this data. But it is the first time that we have, at a glance, the data that shows, at least in the federal space, what does those human trafficking what those human trafficking investigations look like. So I don't have a concrete answer for you on that yet.
Yeah. No, and in the end, what you want to see is many more traffickers prosecuted, and that's the goal. So awareness is good, but then it has a goal in the end. To get to that, one of the biggest issue with, there are plenty, but with human trafficking, big issue is that the total lack of data. We don't know where to look at. So you have the ILO who says there are 21 million people, slaves in the world. You have WOCRI who says, last year said 30 million, this year says 35 million. You don't know how exactly what are the numbers, because we lack data, because many of these, the fight against trafficking happens in different countries, they don't share their data, etc. So there is a big movement now to try to collect the data together, and you have organizations like Palantir and Polaris, etc., who really look at the data issue. But in Palantir, so Peter Austin is, I love the title, is a philanthropist engineer. I love that. So a philanthropist engineer at Palantir, what does he do to really find a way to put the data together and give tools to many, law enforcement and all the ones who want to fight the crime?
Yeah. What do I do is a question I tend to get a lot with that title. But Palantir, kind of as a whole, just beyond the human trafficking space, helps enterprises make sense of their data, right? And we are, to be completely honest here, not experts in human trafficking as a company. But what we are experts at is helping organizations take data they have access to and do what they do, but do it more efficiently, do it better, do it more effectively. And in human trafficking, as you just pointed out, as Barry was pointing to earlier, data can be this very powerful lever, and hopefully really make a difference in terms of bankrupting the effort. One way is obviously through work with law enforcement, right? And this is something we do quite often at the federal, state, local level, with investigations running the gamut from large international investigations to smaller local, small number of victims, right? Like these are all, at each level, data can be very useful. I have the privilege to work on the philanthropy team, which takes this software we've developed in the government space or the commercial space and provides it to nonprofits who are doing excellent work in spaces like disaster relief or global health, or my particular portfolio is human trafficking. And there are pockets of really good data out there, right? And there are some very effective things that can be done with the data that currently exists.
Can you give a concrete example?
Yeah, so one of the, this will have to be a little bit abstract, but one of our partners is Polaris Project, who runs the national hotline. Yeah. I expect many people here are familiar. And they're a great organization, very kind of agile and willing to look at interesting new technological solutions. So we partnered with them on essentially two fronts. One is operational, and in staying victim-centered, as Maria was mentioning, providing, helping call specialists identify the necessary services or the necessary law enforcement contacts in a very small amount of time in these moments when seconds could matter on a call to the national hotline. And then on the other side, over their years running the hotline, operating the hotline, they have been very kind of conscientious about the power that data could eventually have. And they've built up a great data set through the operation of this hotline that can enable them to look at more concrete interventions or more concrete analysis of particular networks of traffickers or networks of victims. So one example, and I'm just going to look down to make sure I get the numbers right, but there have been more than 400 cases of potential sex trafficking at truck stops reported to the hotline since 2007, 60% of which involve minors. And if you kind of take those cases and you take the geographical locations of those cases, you can craft more effective campaigns, right? And so Polaris has been able to collaborate with organizations like Truckers Against Trafficking, and both on an intervention level and a victim support level work to improve those efforts. And so you can see pockets like that across different networks of trafficking, different kinds of victims across the sex and labor trafficking spaces. One of the things
And Polaris last year at Trust Women took the action to help other hotlines around the world to get the network together and share data.
Right.
So you have many in India, in Hong Kong, etc., who are working now with Polaris, and I hope that soon they will really share data.
Yeah, and I mean the tricky part there, right? And this is also not to just keep referencing things that Barry said, but this is also something that came up there, which is there are very real privacy and civil liberties concerns when you get to sharing data, particularly when you get to sharing personal data between organizations or across borders. And there are some of those questions end up being policy questions, and some of those questions actually end up being questions that technology can help with, right? With robust access controls and making sure that people are only seeing and sharing the pieces of data that should be seen and shared. Getting to a point where the answer to sharing data can be yes, because you know that you are only sharing specific pieces of data. You don't have to just take a database dump and hand it over, right? So providing the technological sophistication to nonprofits is an important part of what we do, so
Absolutely.
that they can look toward these data sharing efforts while at the same time protecting the privacy of these very vulnerable populations, right? And making sure that their data remains secure and is not misused.
Yeah. Good, very good. So we are going to move now to Tammy. Tammy Lee Manoche is the Vice President of Corporate Affairs at Carlson. Carlson has been an industry leader since 15 years in the fight against trafficking by many, many different ways. And one which for me is very, very important is that Carlson tries to educate the survivors of trafficking and give them the tools to be able to work after. Because what happens very often is when the survivors finally get out of hell, finally is no longer in the hands of the abuser or his abusers, then finally has repaid the enormous debt they have, etc., then they need a job. And it's very difficult to find a job when you have not been trained, when you have been trafficked since you are 10, or etc. So Carlson has been helping on that, and I would be very happy to listen to what you have done.
Well, thank you. That is actually the job creation side of what Carlson is doing, is kind of at the end of a very long line of Carlson's involvement in this area, as you just mentioned. Carlson has been involved in this effort since 1999, really, when Marilyn Carlson Nelson partnered with Her Majesty Queen Sylvia of Sweden to form the World Childhood Foundation. And at that time, as you may recall, trafficking wasn't on the radar. It wasn't on the agenda. And it wasn't something that you talked about, especially in polite conversation. And even our own legal attorneys said, this is not something Carlson should be putting its name to. But thankfully, we're privately held, and Maryland decided that we were going to be leaders in this area. So for 15 years, we've really been involved in, I'll sum it up as what I call kind of the 5 Ps of eradicating trafficking. And that's using our people power. We educate our employees. All of our employees in our hotels are trained around the world about how to spot and report trafficking. Maryland has been a long-standing voice in this. We do it through our businesses. We have contracts with clauses that have anti-trafficking language in it. We also put warnings in all of our itineraries for any traveler that is booking a flight or a hotel through Carlson Wagenlied Travel to areas that are at high risk for sex trafficking. We do it through our political power. We work with lawmakers on anti-trafficking legislation. We do it through policing power with local county attorneys and the U.S. Attorney's Office. We do it through our philanthropic power, which she was just mentioning. Over the past 15 years, Carlson has probably given much in excess of $5 million, at least approaching $10 million in philanthropic funding in the trafficking area. And this year alone will be close to $1 million from the corporate grant-making group that I oversee. And then finally, it's the public-private partnerships. So getting at the jobs piece is really at the very end of this long journey across the 5 Ps, and that's that public-private partnership. We fund organizations like Breaking Free and 180 Degrees at the Minnesota level. And at the national level, where we work with partners like Polaris and Sabre, who is offering scholarships to trafficking survivors. And at the international level, where we work with the International Tourism Partnership, Youth Career Alliance, to provide jobs in hotels and hospitality for youth at risk of trafficking or trafficking survivors. So this is, the job piece is at the end of a very long spectrum.
Sure.
because you have to start with rescuing the victims, but once you've rescued them and they're now survivors, you have to put them on a pathway to empowerment and prosperity. And that's where Carlson now is today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, you know, I was very stricken last year in a hotel in Rio, in Brazil. You had in the lift, beside the buttons with the floors, a little copper thing where it was written, if you are a minor and you are not here on your own will, please call this number. So it was very striking because you don't see that in many, many hotels. And I was wondering if it is the kind of things you push for or you do at Carlson.
It absolutely is, especially that stems from the training that we have. We've trained tens of thousands of employees around the world in our 1,300 plus hotels. But we also have posters up in the break rooms too that say, if you see something, say something, which very much aligns with the messaging of the Blue campaign too. But all of our general managers and even, you know, housekeepers are trained to spot the signs of trafficking and how to report it. And that's critically important. And while our general counsel and others may have worried about putting signs like that up, having a leader like Marilyn Carlson Nelson just emblazoned that into our culture at Carlson. And even when you check in at a hotel in Brazil, for example, they raise money for the World Childhood Foundation, and they'll sell bracelets at the point of purchase at the check-in counter. They'll sell other collateral. They have signs up about anti-trafficking. So we really educate our customers as well in this. And I mentioned with CWT, we've put warnings on itineraries, probably over 300,000 itineraries now, to trafficking hotspots, so they can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline or a local resource and report signs of suspicious activity. So it's part of our culture and part of who we are.
Okay, good, great. So I want the room to participate. So if any of you wants at some point to jump, please put your hands up, and we have one already. But just before moving to the room, I will come back and ask a few questions. My question to Barry is, given what Western Union is, and given that you are really at the center of an incredible chain, because let's take, for instance, someone in Nepal. He has no job. He cannot find a job in Nepal. So he will listen to a wonderful man, a broker, that will tell him, you know, I have a job for you. Very good. You will be in an office in Qatar, very well paid. You will be a clerk. So pay me, buy your ticket, and I will manage everything for you. So this is how they get enslaved. So then they get to Qatar or to other countries in the Gulf and have their passport taken away, being put on construction buildings, etc., working 15 hours a day under excruciating sun. And we have many examples of this. So the middleman, the one who is recruiting in Qatar, the broker in Nepal for these guys to go to Qatar, and then instead of being in an office, of course, they are slaves and enslaved. How can you help finding these guys? And you know, the job of the broker, the one who recruit these people that become slave after, this is the labor slavery. Labor slavery is 75% of slavery. Sex slavery is only 25. It's the big money maker. On the $150 billion, it's a big chunk of it. But how can Western Union help on that front?
Yeah, there are a few ways, and it's not only Western Union being able to help, it's the banks as well. Yep. There are actually a few typologies or a few red flags in the handout that we provided that talk about what a bank might see in an account that the broker has set up. And there are actually some types of transactions that broker has to do in order to move his money and make necessary payments. So the financial institutions can look for that. One thing that we're able to do, because we have such a large data set, those 29 transactions per second, is we're able to look for patterns, and we can really narrow that down. We use a lot of homegrown tools. I have a team of people who are not compliance professionals. They all have advanced degrees in applied mathematics and quantitative analytics. And that's what they do all day long. They look for patterns, and they're narrow. We had referred to geographic attributes. We can look at payment patterns and try to detect some of the payments that Monique is referring to, and interdict them, prevent them from happening, report them when we do see them. And so those are some of the ways that the financial institutions can help. I was interested, just to make a quick last point on this, those of you who follow this know that the rate of prosecutions is abysmally low, both in the US and elsewhere. And there are multiple reasons for that, but one reason is that it is actually, in many cases, very difficult to get the victims to testify. They may be afraid of retribution against their family members back home. There are always cultural issues. And the interesting thing about approaching this from the financial services perspective is that there are a lot of serious financial crimes that the trafficking businesses are committing. Yeah. And there are successful prosecutions for money laundering and money laundering related offenses against the trafficking rings without needing the witnesses. You can do it based on business records and documents, and it all goes back to the data.
This is very, very important because, as lawyers say, you are as good as your victim when you do a prosecution. And so if your victim is completely traumatized, and so it's a very difficult point. So data is absolutely true. 29 transactions per second, you said, at Western Union.
On average,
my God. Yeah. So indeed, it's a lot. Maria, I have a question for you. When a victim is, and it's not for you as ombudsman, but it's for you as Homeland Security, how is it that in the US there were only 171 people last year to get protection through continued prison status? That is to say, this is the authorization that you can get to be able to work in the US, because very often you are trafficked from outside the US into the US. And you arrive legally because very often you arrive with your passport, and then your passport is taken away, you have no identity, and you become a criminal, or at least you don't have papers. So this protection of the continued prison status is very important. 171 is very, very, very slow.
Right. Yeah. And we agree. Continued presence is supposed to be a temporary form of relief to help stabilize a foreign national victim immediately upon, the start of an investigation. We recognize that the number of continued presence grants has been low, and we have been working with ICE, HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, who has jurisdiction to make requests for continued presence and to grant continued presence to train their victim service specialists and their field agents to make sure they recognize that continued presence is available to help stabilize those victims. So that's a work in progress for us to improve on those numbers. It is, however, not the only immigration benefit that is available to foreign national victims. We continue to see an increase in the number of T and U visas and continue to train law enforcement charged with making certifications so that individuals can receive long-term immigration relief. So we have been doing a lot of training internally in coordination with ICE, HSI, and the federal law enforcement.
So you think it should increase in the coming years?
I think it should increase. We'll see, I think, the good results from our training. And also working with advocates to make sure that they know how to request continued presence. Exactly. It also goes to an access to counsel issue. So we'll handle training of our folks, both from the victim service specialist side and the special agents investigating. But we work closely with the NGOs, and we'll continue to welcome your feedback to see how we can improve continued presence. A big piece also is working with state and local law enforcement and training for the permanent relief. And we have created tools, including a U-Visa certification guide, to give assurance to the state and local law enforcement who are asked to certify applications that these individuals are in fact victims, that Homeland Security supports those certifications, that they're not signing off, they're certifying that someone is eligible for citizenship, that those applications will be fully vetted as they are adjudicated by DHS. And we are going to soon start rolling out, start putting together a similar resource for T visas. So we're on it.
Good.
Yeah.
lot of way for improvement. Do you want to jump in before I turn to the others, or I finish quickly my turn and then I leave it to you? If I were the boss of Palantir, and I was telling my wonderful philanthropist engineer, what is your dream? What is the data you want to look at to change really and to attack really the issue? In your dreams, what would it be?
I don't think there's any one data set that is the answer to that question. I think the answer to that question is the fusion of data from victim services organizations, from law enforcement, from financial transactions, and sometimes you won't be able to actually bring this together. You'll have someone working on the financial transaction, someone working on the victim services data, and they may need to be separate. But really where the value is going to come in is bringing together these individual kind of parts of the picture into a somewhat more cohesive whole. So that is a bit of a dodge, but I do think that the answer there is fusing together these disparate data sources rather than any single data silver bullet that's going to answer, that's going to solve the problem.
We had at the Trust Women conference this year Christopher White, who works at DARPA, which is a government organization here, and he takes entire chunks of the internet and then analyze everything, and it's incredibly powerful because you see the patterns, you see that at the same moment an ad for prostitution, for instance, is the same photo in 20 different countries. So this girl cannot be in 20 different countries, etc. So he takes that and he analyzes, and then he works with NGOs, and this is incredibly powerful. So I hope we will have more and more of this data in the future. One last question to Tammy, and Tammy, and I know it's a very difficult question. Can you tell today that Carlson organization is completely slave-free all along the supply chain?
Well, there's really no way of certifying that, right? Even though we have contracts in all, or clauses in all of our contracts, you can't 100% certify that. However, I think we make best efforts, and we really make this part of our business. We make it part of contract negotiations. So we're very upfront about our commitment to this area, as well as very public, as you mentioned, in all of our businesses that we are committed to this. Beyond that, I think what we do on the philanthropic side is provide different opportunities. So instead of buying a rug that costs $10 or a t-shirt that's 50 cents, we want to provide jobs and income and other pathways so that victims or would-be victims and survivors have a different path. So I think you have to work on both the prevention, the advocacy, and then the philanthropic front to really ensure that we have a slave-free world.
No, I agree. And I think no corporation can say we are 100% sure we have no slave in the supply chain. This is a big issue. So now to the ground. So I don't see very well because I have all the lights in the eyes. So you have to stand up and take a microphone, I guess, and say your name and ask your question.
Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. Very encouraging to hear of companies like Western Union and Carlson that are being very proactive about this. I'm thinking if I'm a trafficker, I'm probably not going to work through your companies. I'll look for a different company. But the question is, for other companies in your fields, are they at some legal liability or risk for not doing due diligence in trying to prevent trafficking? So are there legal pressures that could be placed upon your colleague industry companies? or is it more a matter of the consumer pressure to ask their banks and travel agents whether they're doing all that they should be doing?
Tammy?
Sure. So I think you have two choices in business. You do these things voluntarily and you lead by example, or legislation happens. And I think Carlson has been active in this for 15 years. And we were one of the first companies to sign ECPAT back in 2004, and then the UN Global Code of Conduct in 2010. Other hotel companies were slower to follow that for reasons that I mentioned about why our lawyers were initially reticent. But I think if you don't get out and lead on this, you do risk legislation. And in fact, Senator Feinstein was considering legislation mandating training in the hotel industry. And we were able to tell enough of a positive story about all the training that is happening. And she was even going to try and mandate that that everybody sign the UN Global Code of Conduct. And some global hotel companies just don't sign codes for various reasons. But I think we wanted to get out front as an industry and demonstrate that we are doing the right things. And I think, so there are incentives to do that, as well as, there's penalties for not doing it. I would have to say I'm really pleased that across the travel industry, the airlines are on board, the bus companies, train companies, that's really what the Blue Campaign is all about. So I feel like companies are proactively doing this. The American Bar Association, on behalf of all industries, also looked at this issue earlier this year and created language that they can give to all their corporate clients about putting anti-trafficking or anti-slavery clauses in all the corporate contracts. So I think this is positively expanding beyond the travel and tourism industry.
Okay, another question over there?
Thank you. My name is Patricia Ham. I'm a political scientist and I am a consultant on human trafficking. I would like to hear from all of you, if you know, but particularly from DHS, to what extent is the U.S. Engaging in significant programs abroad to fight human trafficking in other aspects of organized crime, like drug trafficking, for example? The U.S. is providing assistance to countries, for example, in the Americas. How much is the U.S. government doing to fight human trafficking? Thank you.
Maria.
So I'll start, and let me first, for those of you who do not know, that there is the President's Interagency Task Force to Combat Human Trafficking. I sit in the Senior Policy Operating Group that supports the cabinet level secretaries who sit in that council advise the president on human trafficking. The office of the TIP office, the Trafficking in Persons office at the Department of State runs the Senior Policy Operating Group. So there is a lot of interagency work that is happening, and it is robust, it is meaningful. In January, we will release our interagency accomplishments for this past fiscal year, and the President's Interagency Task Force will meet. That will be available for you to stream. It will be streamed live, and you can watch that online. It will give you a better sense of the work that's happening across the interagency. I can tell you from DHS's perspective, through Homeland Security investigations work here and the authorities that it has to investigate crimes, not just human trafficking crimes, but also financial crimes abroad, we are using all our assets to make sure that the work, our mission and our priorities in combating human trafficking through a variety of means continues to be advanced. Here locally, we have also partnered with the State Department and have partnered with other interagency folks to go we have planned training and have been working on training law enforcement abroad. Over the past year, we have trained in at least 10 countries. Right now, members of DHS, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, are in the Dominican Republic and in Haiti conducting law enforcement sensitive trainings. So there has been a wide range of training activities abroad. They have been done by the interagency. Many of these countries are requesting the additional resources in countries like Brazil, El Salvador, Togo, where we have been recently. So the work is not just domestic. The training work, especially for law enforcement, is also going abroad, in addition to the wide range of investigative work that is happening pursuant to our respective authorities.
Other questions? Yeah, over there.
Adam Carroll from Burma Task Force again, and just to ask a bit of a trust question, but it goes beyond that because we're at a human rights conference, and so there are some human rights implications outside the box that we've been hearing, which is mostly law enforcement tilted. I'm wondering, first of all, in some countries, people will be nervous about yet another layer of exploitation from the law enforcement in the country. For example, the Thai Navy participated in exploitation and trafficking of Rohingya refugees in the past year. So the involvement of local law enforcement around the world may be one major concern, but also about our own law enforcement. And you know, obviously there are a lot of trust issues around law enforcement. As a Muslim, for example, I also feel the same unease about banking and data mining, because I know a lot of people who have had their bank accounts closed, and I know a lot of people who are still on those lists after years and years and years for secondary inspection. And so, you know, the question of narrow application of this data rather than broad, you know, having criteria that doesn't conflate, for example, sex work with trafficking. I know there are many differences. And then last, I guess, though I suppose I could elaborate, but indentured servitude is nothing new in the U.S. You know, from our 7th grade history books, we know. So are there some possible mitigation approaches rather than eradication approaches that might both legalize or unionize victims, or, you know, finding a creative approach in order not just to take a law enforcement, let's stamp it out, which is very difficult, but to figure out a way to transform these exploitive networks to become something at least a little better.
Wow, a lot of questions there. Barry, you want to start with the
yeah,
banks?
There were
maybe?
a lot of questions and a lot of points,
Yeah.
which, by the way, I happen to agree with. But I think one of the obvious responses to one of your last questions was immigration amnesty for victims. So that, you know, that's another reason, by the way, why victims won't testify, because they're afraid of being deported, and that's a reasonable fear based on history. But but there's federal legislation, and it's not brand new. It's been around for a while, and it's good legislation, in my view, that provides for immigration amnesty for victims. These are the victims; they're not the ones to be punished. So I think initiatives like that are directly responsive to your concerns, and I think they're right.
I just want to put in a plug for law enforcement, because we've worked at the county attorney level and with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I do believe that they are a part of the solution. I believe they've embraced the challenge of eradicating human trafficking. And from our perspective, it is not enough to mitigate on this issue. We will not stop until we eradicate human slavery. And law enforcement is a really important part of that solution. Also, federal legislation in this area. Senator Klobuchar has a bill that's being hotlined this week that would make sure that there are stiffer penalties for traffickers, but also to treat survivors as victims and not as felons, and to fully fund the human trafficking hotline. That's bipartisan legislation. It's already passed through the House with the support of Minnesota Congressman Eric Paulson. So this is an issue that I don't say that we don't agree to anything less than full eradication from our perspective.
Very good. I think we have time for another question and probably no more. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Faiza Matomatier. I'm with ECPAT USA, and I want to first thank the panel for such a wonderful discussion. My question is for Barry or Peter. You mentioned earlier about the internet and child sexploitation online, and how we can use money laundering as a ways to stop these transactions from occurring and shut down these sites, as evidenced by my Red Book closing earlier this year. But I'm curious what your organizations are doing for companies that aren't doing illicit money activities like Backpage.com, and ways that we can disrupt the online exploitation of children using innovative techniques.
So when I was at J.P. Morgan Chase, we did a big project which we called the Craigslist project. So you refer to Backpage, Craigslist is just another page. And we built a model where we identified a lot of transactions that had a statistically significant correlation to trafficking. Sharing that information with law enforcement led to what I referred to earlier. It led to arrests and victim rescues and asset forfeitures. What we're doing now, we're not convened under the Chatham House rules, so I don't want to be specific. But I can tell you that we are reverse engineering and have reverse engineered a lot of cases that have been brought to us by law enforcement around the world. And we have used tools like Palantir, for example, and others to build financial models to identify how the money is moving based on actual cases that we're told about, so that we can interdict those types of payments and disrupt the business.
And one word has not been pronounced here, which is absolutely crucial to trafficking. It is corruption. Corruption is the grease without which trafficking would not exist. And so this is a very big issue because you work in so many countries, Barry, where corruption is something endemic. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think the corruption proceeds, this is not designed to elicit laughter, but I think the corruption proceeds are going through the banks. There's no doubt that is absolutely part of the problem. But the transactions that we're looking at, obviously we do a lot of screening for corruption typologies, but the big cases involving corruptions are on the banking side. What we're seeing different types of payments for different types of labor trafficking typologies and different types of sex trafficking, less on the corruption side.
Okay, great. So I think that, we have done our time. We have to wrap up now. I think it was a very interesting panel indeed. We heard of concrete actions that can be taken to fight the scourge of trafficking. And I think this is the most important. And I'm with you. Until it's not eradicated, it will not be finished. So thank you very much to our panelists. And I think we can really...